So moving on to the third section of Gustafson's grief, I'm glad you made it this far because this is the most important section. And it's because it's in this section that he presents his definition of grief. He calls it G. It's right here at the bottom of page 463, or begins there. Yes, this is the crucial section, and this is the most important thing in the whole essay, is this definition of grief. Everything before has been leading up to it. Everything afterwards is an explanation or defense of it. So this is absolutely crucial. Let me read it through. G. Grief is a belief of the form that P, and I will backtrack and try to explain that, and attendant feelings, such as feelings of loss, pain, anger, fear, distress, and unhappiness, and a desire of the form that not be, in a whole psychological context. So the first thing to note about this definition, G, is that it has three components. So basically what he's saying is that all three of these things have to be present in order to say that someone is actually grieving. Let's see what they are. He starts and says grief is a belief of the form that P. So the first component is cognitive. It has to do with a belief. Something we believe to be true. Of course, later it's specified that that belief has to be that someone has died or something similar, at least to it. Grief is a belief of the form that P. P stands for any proposition. So the belief is that P, standing for any statement. The belief that P is true. Okay, that's the first component, is the cognitive or knowledge or belief component. Second component, and attendant feelings, such as feelings of loss, pain, etc. So the second component is a feeling component, an affective component, I guess, in the more technical language. He's not too worried about exactly what feeling is there, except that it's negative: unhappiness, pain, anger, loss, if that's a feeling. So we have a belief component and we have a feeling component, and a desire of the form that not be. So the third component is the desire component, what he will call sometimes the conative component, again using more technical philosophical language. A desire, a wanting of some sort, and crucially, the desire, he says, is of the form that not be. So what's absolutely essential to his definition of grief is that you have a belief component that P is true, whatever P is, and you have a desire component that P not be true. That is, you have a conflict between what you believe and what you desire. That's absolute. That's really his contribution to this thing. The first two components, the belief component and the feeling component, I think are pretty standard. It's the desire component, the desire that what you believe not be true, which is his real contribution here, what he's really trying to get across. Because what's really, really important is that the belief component and the desire component clash. They can't both be, well, the desire cannot be fulfilled if the belief is true. So this is really crucial to his definition of grief. Just to look at some highlights here in the rest of the section. In G, P is satisfied. That is, we can plug in for P a proposition or statement or sentence to the effect that a certain person is dead, has died, or has been almost certainly lost or permanently separated from the agent whose grief is under consideration. That is, he leaves it open what P is, but what he really means is that P is the belief that someone has died. Now, of course, this immediately opens up the question about whether you can grieve over anything else besides the loss of someone close to you or a person close to you. And that is something he'll have to deal with, and something that he kind of has an answer for. But that opens up a legitimate area of questioning. But right away, he wants to more or less confine the paradigm, let's say, our central experience of grief as being over someone close to you who's died. if you look down to page 465 in the middle of the page, he says the most contentious condition in G is the condition I will call the counter belief desire. That's a good thing to get into your head, this terminology. The desire component of grief is a counter belief desire. That is, the desire runs counter to the belief. Meaning, let's just read what he says. According to this condition, grief is partly constituted by a desire that what one believes or takes to be true should not be so. That is, we have this belief that someone has died. We have this desire that they not have died. So that the desire is unfulfillable, let's say. The object of the desire that someone be alive instead of dead is unfulfillable. It's impossible to get on the condition of the belief. This is why it's a counter belief desire. The desire runs counter to what we know to be true, to what we believe. Now, crucially, what he means by the desire component, he begins to specify. He says, the import of this condition lies in the fact that in it, desire occurs in its genuine or full sense. This is important. That is, what we'll see is that there'll be a really important distinction here between a desire and a wish. A desire is something that is, first of all, strong, and secondly, a desire is something that prompts you to action to fulfill the desire. That would be the full or genuine or full sense. That is, if I have a genuine desire, it means that I am prompted to do something to fulfill that desire. As we'll see later, if I simply wish for something to be true, then I don't necessarily do anything to make it true. If I have a desire to run a marathon, if I have a real desire to run a marathon, that is going to prompt me to do things to be able to run a marathon. If I have a wish that I could fly like a bird or fly like Superman, that does not necessarily prompt me to do anything to be able to fly like a bird or fly like Superman. Because a wish can be for anything, whether it's possible or not. Whereas if a desire is for something which we clearly know to be impossible, then there's certain complications, right? And the complications are here at the bottom of the page, rationality conditions. As we'll see, what Gustafson will be arguing is that the rationality conditions for a desire are different from the rationality conditions for a wish. And this is crucial, right? Because then he starts talking about the rationality conditions for grief. And this is an important point. Because what he wants to say is what he says here at the top of page 466. Grief is irremediably less than fully rational along one of these dimensions, and that's the desire dimension. The distinction is that with any emotions, sometimes it's irrational to feel it, at least to the extent that we do. For instance, again, if I fly into a rage because I overcooked my soft-boiled egg, that's irrational. That rage is irrational. If we fall into grief because we find that Julius Caesar died 2,000 years ago, that would probably be irrational. But what's interesting about grief is that, as he says, grief is irremediably less than fully rational. What he wants to argue, I believe, is that to be grieving is to be in an irrational state. Why? Because of this counter-belief desire. Because what we desire to be true and what we know to be true are incompatible. So it's not just that, well, all emotions or most emotions or many emotions have rationality conditions so that sometimes it's irrational to feel them. Grief is essentially irrational. Not that it's irrational to grieve, Look what he says here a little bit farther down on page 466. Grief, however, is overwhelmingly appropriate to its agent's epistemically available evidence and corresponding beliefs. This is a consequence of the fact that the onset of grief, its immediate cause, is the belief or knowledge caused by the death of a beloved. Say, so it's not irrational to grieve if someone close to you dies, but to be grieving is to be in an irrational state because of the clash between what you desire to be true and what you know to be true. Um, I think if we look here down at the bottom of the page, when he says, thirdly, emotions may be less than fully rational in the dimension of their ingredient desires. According to theory G, grief is irrational in this respect, that is, in the desire, what he calls the conative respect. For instance, G is satisfied as follows. S grieves N's death. S knows and believes that N is dead. S has feelings of loss, pain, anger, and the like at the loss of N. So far, so good. It's not irrational. And importantly, S desires that it not be the case that N is dead. That's where the irrationality comes into it. In suitable circumstances, these conditions are sufficient for S's grief at the death of N. Which is to say, if all these things are in place, that means that S is actually grieving. Note that S's belief and S's desire are incompatible. That is, a belief and a desire had by an agent at a given time are incompatible in this way in case the desire is unsatisfiable on the truth of the belief. Meaning, if the belief is true, you can't satisfy the desire. Yet you still have the desire. That's the important thing. S's desire is unsatisfiable right here. In whatever sense of necessary, it is true that the dead cannot also be alive, that is, not dead. In that sense, S's desire is necessarily unsatisfiable. Since S's belief that N is dead is true and reasonably held, S understands this very necessity. Thus, S's desire is inherently irrational. So, to conclude this particular video, at the top 467, G then implies that the emotion of grief is, in just this way, inherently less than rational or irrational in its desired dimension. I'm going to make another video, try to wrap it up, because there are a couple of other things, especially the distinction between the desire and the wish. But this is about it. This is the crucial part of it, where he presents this definition of G, and everything else will, again, everything so far has been leading up to this definition. Everything that follows is really an explanation and defense against possible objections, which I won't get into in any detail to this definition of grief.